Welcome everybody to the next session in the series of Meet the Oracle Masters, the online series. Today we have a presentation by Dan McGhan, learning JavaScript concepts from real-world solutions. As you know, this is it's the 6th episode of the series. The recordings for the other sessions are already available at our website. Recording for this session will become available somewhere probably next week. And for now, enjoy the talk by Dan McGhan.
And I will turn on video as well. Okay, you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, let's do it. So this is learning JavaScript concepts from real-world solutions. And up until a few weeks ago, I was a developer advocate at Oracle. I have recently changed my role, however. I've joined the pandemic response team where we are using Apex to develop applications to help with the pandemic as quickly as possible. The idea for this talk came from, I should say loosely came from the Database Concepts Guide, which is part of the Oracle documentation, freely available online. Hopefully everybody here is aware of this guide. If not, you should definitely read it. It's one of the types of things that you can read to just make yourself a better developer overall, especially with Oracle Database. But of course, when you really understand the concepts behind how something works, you're just going to use it better, be able to debug it better, and so on. So highly, highly recommend this guide. Of course, that guide is broken down into various categories, and I thought I would break this talk down into various categories as well, and then point out different parts as we're covering these categories. So the first and most sort of basic or core level is JavaScript, the language. You're going to need to learn something about that when working with Apex. Going one level up from that are what we call web APIs. And oftentimes people confuse these for JavaScript, the core language, but these are in fact separate. They would not be available if you're working with JavaScript in a mid-tier environment, such as Node.js. But these include things like the DOM, which we'll be talking about today, Ajax, and of course there are many others, and we keep getting new ones all the time. It's what makes JavaScript so powerful within a web browser. Then we have frameworks and libraries, and this is going to include things like jQuery, jQuery UI, Jet, and even the Apex JavaScript libraries. There are lots of these, and you'll need to learn to work with them on a regular basis when working in and with Apex. And then, of course, working across all of these layers is not going to be easy if you don't learn how to use your browser's developer tools. So I'm going to touch on some of the more important parts of your dev tools today as well. So let's just dive in. We're going to look at real-world solutions and problems that I've seen out in the wild. And we start with this first one. This is from Scott Wesley. He tweeted on September 20th of 2019, if you want to change the label of an item, you can do so using this little one-liner of JavaScript code he provided here. And actually, I looked on his blog. He had a related blog post on this where he didn't use just one line, he used two, but this is the basic idea. You can see I'm focusing in an item and that label above is changing dynamically. And the use case here would be like you have maybe a parent item and you select the value in the parent item. Maybe that changes the context of a child item down further and you want to sort of let the user know. That might be one use case. So in the blog post, he provided not one but two solutions for this, and they're really doing the same exact thing at the end of the day. And if you read from left to right, the first thing that jumps out at you is this $sign. And the $sign is nothing magical going on here. It's just a reference to the jQuery library, which is included for you by default in Apex. And jQuery is what we call a DOM manipulation library. Ooh, it gives rise to the question, what is the DOM? So hopefully everybody here is at least familiar with HTML. That's the markup language your browser is going to use to render a web page. In the early days of the web, you had a browser, and then you had a web server, and the browser would request a web page. The server would respond with that static document, and then the browser would render it, and that was it. But of course, browser manufacturers wanted to allow us to be able to do more. So when that request would come over for a web page, that web page would send, in addition to that static content, some code, which would allow you to programmatically change what's going on over there in the client side without another request response cycle. And that's, you know, really what JavaScript is all about. But in order to allow that to happen, we needed a standard, and that standard is the DOM, or Document Object Model. And you can think of the DOM as two parts. You have this in-memory representation of the underlying HTML web page. And because HTML is hierarchical in nature, the DOM tree, as it's referred to sometimes, is also going to be hierarchical in nature. And we also have an API for working with and manipulating that memory structure as well. So those are the two main parts. So here's a basic example where we have a HTML document. You can see that body is under HTML, so that's the child of HTML. And of course, HTML is the parent of body. And in the body, we have a paragraph with some text and then a div with an image. Now, the first thing the browser is going to do these days, it's going to parse that document and turn it into what you see here, which is the DOM tree. And so the structure is very similar, except that these nodes have methods or APIs, which allow us to manipulate their properties, such as their content and other properties like are they enabled, disabled, and so on. And when we do that, of course, the changes are reflected in the user's browser immediately. Now, the early days of the DOM APIs were not so good. They had really tedious APIs for doing things like selection, traversal, and manipulation, but also they were not even consistently implemented. It seemed like IE or Microsoft was doing things one way, and then everyone else was doing things another way. So you would have code that would say, you know, if you're working on IE, execute this code path, otherwise go over here and execute that one. And nobody wants to write code like that. jQuery came in 2006 and largely solved this problem by providing a very easy to use API that worked consistently across all major web browsers, which was great. I will point out that the DOM APIs these days, they are improving slowly but surely. There's even a website I point out here, you might not need jQuery.com. So a lot of folks go there and just search for the, say, a method you're using in jQuery, and it will show you how you can do the equivalent these days using modern DOM APIs. However, I do think it's still easier to use jQuery. It's still a bit simpler, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon in Apex, so it's still safe and probably better to use, especially when you're learning these concepts in the beginning. So highly recommend learning jQuery still. All right, so what is jQuery? Well, nothing special there either. jQuery is just a function, and when you have a function, just like in any other language, what are you going to do? You're going to invoke it, and we do that with parentheses, of course. So we're going to invoke jQuery, and in this case, what we're passing in both examples is a string, and the string is what we call a selector. It's a very expressive way to select elements within the web page. So when you learn about these selectors, you always have to start with the basics, and the most basic is by selecting by ID. You can see the syntax for that here. You're going to start with the hashtag and then the name of the ID. So the example on the right here, we're using jQuery. We're invoking it, passing the string hash message. So this would select the element on the page that has an ID of message. IDs work like a primary key. There should be only one. So you'll either get 1 or 0 elements in that case. The next one you'll want to learn is the class selector. So just swap out that hash for a period, follow that with the class name. And then in this case, in the example we're seeing, we're going to select all of the elements that have a class of boring. And that could select multiple elements because an element can have many classes and multiple elements can have the same class. That's all perfectly valid in the web page. Now the next one is the element. This is a little more generic, but you can just, in this case, select all of the unordered lists in a web page. And it's worth pointing out that you can combine multiple selectors, just providing jQuery with a comma-separated list of individual selectors. So here we're selecting a combination of elements that have a class of fun as well as the element that has an ID of message. So here's a basic web page I created to help us learn about these selectors. And you can see it's got some simple text, how are you feeling? And it has a list of basic emotions. These were identified by Paul Ekman, a psychologist who was kind of traveling the world over back in the 60s, I believe, and he identified these emotions as emotions that humans didn't need to learn. They were sort of universally experienced across the world. Oddly enough, the majority are negative, not positive. So we have happy. And then, of course, all of these, sad, fearful, disgusted, angry, are negative. And surprised is sort of the neutral one. It depends on the surprise, of course. And at the bottom, you see an input and a submit button. So here's the HTML behind the scenes that I used to create that web page. You can see the text at the top here. You can see our emotions list with the list elements, and then a class which represents if they're positive, negative, or neutral, and our inputs at the bottom. So let's start with the basics. If you want to select an element by its ID, again, we just put the hash in front of the ID. In this case, I'm going to get this H1, which has an ID equal to question, or I can go after the unordered list by targeting the ID emotions-list. If I want to go after an element with a class of positive, you see how I can do that here. If I go after negative, it's possible I'm going to get 4 elements back in the response rather than just 1. So here I'm selecting by the element or tag name. I'm getting all of the divs on the page. And here I'm selecting the inputs you see at the bottom. So those are the basics and how that kind of works. I'll talk about the one at the top here a little bit later. But the question is, how did he know to use that or those selectors? And the answer is using DevTools. So if you go in and inspect your document, you'll land on the Elements tab and you'll be locked in on the one you inspected. And you can go up to its parent divs, to a sibling div, and open that up to find the label. And you'll see the 4 and the ID attributes there. Those are the hooks that you can then target with JavaScript. That's how we knew how to do that. So pretty simple. Now, jQuery is a function. Of course, functions are going to return something. And in the case of jQuery, what you're going to get back is a jQuery object. So the object is going to have these properties and methods that make it easy to work with the DOM. That's what jQuery is all about. In this case, we're invoking the text method and passing in a string, which of course is going to update that label text that we saw earlier. Now, there are many different methods that jQuery exposes to you that allow you to do different things depending on your use case. You can, for example, add and remove classes using these functions here. You see an example here where I'm selecting a list item with a class of done, and I'm removing that class done and then adding the class pending. You have various methods for modifying attributes. And the difference, by the way, between an attribute and a property is attribute is sort of like HTML level, and property is like DOM level. After the HTML is read into the DOM, you can work with the properties, and really you can use either or. But in this case, I'm selecting all the inputs on a web page and setting the attribute disabled equal to disabled. Adder can work as both a setter and a getter. If you pass in a single attribute, it works as a getter. And if you pass in 2 parameters, it works as a setter. For DOM insertion or adding new content to the DOM, you have a variety of methods at your disposal here. What I'm doing is selecting an unordered list and then appending to the bottom of that list a new list item which has the text hello. I could use prepend to put that list item at the top of the list. For DOM removal, you have a couple of options. In this case, I'm emptying an object that would get rid of all of its children. I could also have used remove, which would not only get rid of the children, but the actual object itself. And then at the bottom, you can also target individual CSS properties using the CSS method, in this case, changing color to red. So here are a few more examples, starting with the element that has a class of neutral. I can then use the add class method to add a class, such as positive, and then I can follow it up with remove class and set that to neutral. Remove the class neutral. So now this one at the bottom would be positive. And what you're seeing at the top here is an example of what we call chaining. So we're starting with this jQuery object, which is returned from this function call here. And that returns the object that has the class, or the method rather, add class. And then this method is going to return the same type of jQuery object. So then we can chain and make the call to remove class. We can do this all in one line. And this is another one of these things that made API really easy and fun to use, not something you're going to find in the native DOM APIs. In this case, again, it's a little bit more of an advanced selector we'll touch on here in a moment, but I'm selecting the input at the top that has a type of text. And then I'm using the attr method to set disabled to disabled. And at this point, the end user would not be able to interact with that element because it would be disabled. Here I'm selecting the emotions list, the unordered list with that ID, and I'm appending in a new list item at the bottom. This one is amusement, which was something Paul Ekman identified later as he revisited his initial list. Finally, here I'm selecting question. Generally speaking, if you want to change the text of something, it's better to do it server-side, like in the Apex engine or application. But if for whatever reason you couldn't, then no problem. You can just manipulate that text by passing in the string that you would like it to say, and just do that at page load. All right, so this one, pretty simple. But as you can see, we've covered a variety of things within those different categories I pointed out earlier. So we've already touched on the web APIs I was talking about. So we know a little bit about the DOM and the DOM tree. We've touched on some frameworks and libraries. We've already gotten into jQuery, touched on basic selectors and manipulation. And of course, we've also gotten into working with the Elements tab in our browser's developer tools. Let's move on to the next one. So this one came from Anton Nielsen and Jorge Rimblas. They were working in an app where they saw this pattern where the user would use an interactive report to drill down until they got a single row of data. They would then click edit and go to the form page for that single row. And they wanted to make it a little more efficient. And when that report got to a single row, immediately go there. So you can see how this works here. If I add a filter to this interactive report, we get 5 rows, no automatic navigation. But if we get it down to a single row, automatic navigation. Now, if I hit cancel and go back, we're not trapped in some kind of never-ending loop, right? This needs to allow reverse navigation, but you get the basic idea here. Now, this solution, the one that they came up with, required 2 lines of JavaScript code, but as you can see, there's a lot packed in there. Just like before, well, actually, no, just in this case, the lines of code were meant for a dynamic action. And as I see it, there are really 4 ways you can add JavaScript code to your Apex applications. And we'll look at the first 2 here today. So dynamic actions and dynamic actions with JavaScript hooks, but there are also page and component level attributes, and then you get into static files for more advanced use cases. So what are dynamic actions? They're just a declarative way for you to add dynamic behaviors to your Apex applications. And just like everything else in Apex, the idea here is that you're going to use different screens and properties and menus to configure the types of behaviors you want to have happen and when. And then Apex will go ahead and generate all that JavaScript code for you and add it to the page and run it at the right time. There are, again, 2 parts to dynamic action. So we have the dynamic action itself, which you can think of as the parent. This is where you're going to define what you want to have happen and when. So maybe the click of a button or maybe the change of an item's value are good examples. And then the actions you can think of as the children. And these are what are going to happen as a response to the dynamic action itself. Perhaps you'll hide or show some child element or something like that. So here's an example I often use where maybe you have a requirement where it says you need to disable the alternate phone field until the phone number field is populated. And I sometimes think through these dynamic actions with questions like this. You know, what is the driver? In this case, it would be the phone number field. And maybe more specifically, I'll combine that with the event. It's the change of the value of the phone number field that is going to affect what happens elsewhere in the page. Is there a condition? Now, the condition with dynamic actions is what creates a fork in the road between true and false actions. And there would be a condition in this case because if the value of phone number is, let's say, null or not populated, then we want to disable the alternate phone field. That's one path. But if it is not null or has a value, then we want to enable the alternate phone field. So we need the condition to create those true-false actions. And is page load relevant? It is in this case because when you think about it, when the page is rendered, and before we change the value of phone number, we may need to, or actually we do need to, enable or disable the alternate phone field according to the value of phone number. So page load is relevant in addition to the change event on the driving element. It ends up looking like this. You have your parent and your children, and the parent, we're going to configure it such that when the phone number changes, and we'll specify a client-side condition of value is null. In that case, we'll disable alternate phone field and make sure that this action also fires. There's a property at the child level where we can have it fire at page load, so we'll make sure to enable that. And then if that's false, we'll enable the alternate phone field, and of course do the same, execute that at page load as well. All right. So that's dynamic actions in a nutshell, but dynamic actions alone are not going to be enough. They can't cover everything, and the creators of the dynamic action framework knew that when they created it. So rather than try to create a framework that was all-encompassing, which would have been impossible, they provided different areas where, provided you have the knowledge of JavaScript, you can use little tidbits here and there to extend the framework and make it much more powerful than it would otherwise be. Personally, I feel like this is the sweet spot for most Apex developers. You'll be able to meet most requirements provided you can use these JavaScript hooks. And I'll point out a few areas where you'll find these. So starting at the parent level, at the dynamic action, when you look at the when area and the event selection here, this dropdown has lots of different events you can leverage, but not all events are going to be in that dropdown. So if you don't see the one you're looking for, no problem. Just select custom. It will expose this custom event field here where you can type in the name of any event you want. You can also do a space delimited list of event names because they're using jQuery behind the scenes, and jQuery supports that. Here we have the selection type. Again, normally you're going to select something declarative like a button on the page or maybe an item, something like that. But sometimes you want to work with something a bit more dynamically. And if you know how to use a jQuery selector, you can select this option and then provide that selector down here, provided you know how to write it. Now, the next area, moving down from the when, we're still at the parent level, but going down from when to the client-side condition. The defaults for the client-side condition all work with, the value of a single item in the page. And that's nice and easy, but not always perfect for every use case. So you have this JavaScript expression option that you can leverage, provided you can write a JavaScript expression. This is going to be far more powerful, give you access to the entire web page, so you can check the value of multiple items or do something completely unrelated to values. You have lots of different options there. Now moving down to the children or the child level, you'll see that there are lots of different declarative actions: hide, show, enable, disable, even refresh, which is great because it's declarative AJAX. But again, not going to cover everything. So you have this catch-all here, execute JavaScript code. You can just put in any JavaScript code that you can write in there and hopefully cover anything that you can't do out of the box. So these lines were meant for a dynamic action. And more specifically, the first line is targeted at that client-side condition, and then the second one for the execute JavaScript action. Now, if we focus on the first part, the client-side condition, you're seeing some things that should already be familiar, right? We know that this is a jQuery function invocation. It's something we've already talked about, and we're passing it a selector again. And this selector, as I mentioned, is a little advanced, so let's go ahead and break that down. The first advanced selector I'll show you are these hierarchical selectors. So say we start higher up in the web page. In this case, I'm selecting the div that has a class of question wrapper. And then maybe I want to select something under it. I don't want that particular div. I want something under it. So I start with that, and I can add then greater than in div. And this is the child selector. So this goes exactly one level down and selects what you tell it to. In this case, the div. You'll note that these inputs down here are at that same level, but we don't select those because we targeted the div. If I omit the greater than and just have a space between two selectors, this is the descendant selector. And instead of going just one level, it goes all the way down the DOM tree, selecting what you tell it to, in this case, all of the divs. So I not only get the div directly below it, but also the one beneath that one. Here are a few others. So there are form selectors you should be aware of. In this case, :button will select all of the button elements in the page. Now this input element down here is not a button element, but because its type is equal to button, jQuery knows to go ahead and select it. We have some content selectors. So in this case, I'm selecting elements that have the text R in them, and you can see, again, because of that hierarchical nature of HTML, we're going to get the parent elements because they also contain that text. And this will go up all the way even to elements that aren't on the page. And then finally, we get to the attribute selector, which is what we saw before. Now, the attribute selector just uses these square brackets, and you put the name of the attribute between them. So we're saying, give me the elements that have an attribute of type. You can be more exact. You can say, give me the elements that have a type that have a value equal to text. And because I started the selector with double quotes on the outside, the text here is in single quotes. You can reverse that with single quotes on the outside and then double quotes on the inside. Either one will work. You can be even more expressive, or I should say exact, and say, give me only the input elements that have an attribute of type equal to text. And this is actually very similar to what we were seeing before. So it's an advanced selector, but it's an attribute selector to be exact. And it reads like, give me the table data elements that have a headers attribute with a value equal to link. And the question, of course, is how did they know to use that selector? Well, again, it just comes down to using your browser's developer tools. So here in this example, we are targeting the, or inspecting rather, this header row. So this isn't the data row, but just the headers. And when you look in here, you'll see that the table header attribute or element has an attribute ID that's equal to link. And then if you go down into the data within the same column and you inspect here, you'll find that the table data elements have this attribute headers equal to link. And it's sort of like a pointer. Each row in this column is going to have this pointer back to the header row. So this is sort of a way for you to be able to target and count the rows, right? Because you can select these, and depending on how many you get, you'll get a certain number of, you'll get the actual count of rows in the report. So that's how they knew to use that selector. And again, jQuery is going to return a jQuery object. That object is going to have a length property, which tells you how many elements you selected. And of course, they're just checking to see if it's equal to 1, because the automatic navigation from the report to the form page should happen when there's exactly 1 row of data. So they're checking for a single row. And you can see what that looks like in the dynamic action configuration here. So at the parent level, after the refresh of the employees region, then check this client-side condition, right? And if this is true, we come into the true path here and we execute some JavaScript code. And that brings us to the second line here. So you see this apex.navigation as we read from left to right. Those are the first things that are going to jump out. And these are just namespaces in Apex. And the namespaces go back sort of to the beginnings of JavaScript APIs in Apex, and they've been there for a very long time. You may wonder why we would need JavaScript APIs in Apex. We already have lots of other libraries in there. And I have this sort of guide here at the bottom, and I realize I'm speaking to a European audience. Forgive me for having started this, should have started at level 0, but play along if you will. At the bottom, I've grouped these a little bit differently than you saw before. Before, when I talked about the different categories that we were going to learn across today, that was kind of a leveled system. Here, or I should say there, that's more like the landscape of JavaScript in general. But here, we're looking at it in the context of Apex specifically. And so at the bottom level here, we have the native JavaScript code you'll be writing, like the language, and working with web APIs such as the DOM or AJAX. One layer up from that is going to be jQuery, jQuery UI, and even Jet. I'm putting Jet at this level as well. And then the next level is where you get into the Apex APIs. And the Apex APIs, they're going to be able to use any of this lower level stuff, but this is where you get to code that knows something about Apex, right? jQuery, as great as it is, does not know anything about how Apex works, its architecture, how it does AJAX or anything. So it's when you come up here that you start to get APIs that are better for use in Apex. And then of course, you're going to write your own custom JavaScript code on top of all of this stuff. You can access any of it as needed as per the requirements. So these APIs came in for a good reason. They've been here for a long time. And when they first came in, they were just sort of stuck anywhere, sort of willy-nilly. These were called the global or non-namespace APIs. They were great for convenience because you didn't have to type a lot, but there was some risk that they would collide with other global functions, if you will. However, some of these are still sticking around today and quite heavily used, like $X, $B, and $S. $X is just a shorthand for document.getElementById. Obviously, $X is a lot shorter than document.getElementById, but it's just a pointer to the same function. $V is how you could get the value of an Apex item. And this is what I mean by, these are Apex aware. So if this were a checkbox item and multiple items were checked, when you say get the value of this checkbox item, it will give you that colon delimited list, which is what you would get when the item is submitted into session state. And there's $S, which can set the value of a checkbox item. Again, it's intelligent, right? You can pass in a colon delimited list and it will check the options as required. Now, that was the early days. And again, some of these are still floating around, but for the most part, things have moved to namespace code. And the idea here is that you kind of introduce one thing at that global or top level. And in the case of Apex, it's Apex. And then everything else is going to chain off of that. So there are now a number of different namespaces available, and they're all documented in the JavaScript API documentation for Apex. Apex is, again, the root namespace, and you can see in the documentation that it's got a number of properties, events that you can work with, and some functions. And you can just learn about other namespaces, such as the navigation namespace. One of the functions it has is a redirect method, and you just tell it where you want to redirect to, pass in a URL, and it will go there. So that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing some references to namespaces, and that redirect method is going to take users to a new URL. What they needed to do is go from the report page to the form page, and so they needed to get that URL that was used to do that, and that's what this one is all about. This is basically a jQuery selector that then gets the attribute href for that URL. And how did they know to use that? Again, with the browser's developer tools, when you inspect the button that a normal user would click to do the navigation manually, you'll see that it's just an anchor element that has an href attribute, and the URL is in here, along with even the checksum that would be necessary to do that navigation correctly. So that's what we have here. We're selecting the table data element that has a headers equal to link. So that's sort of the parent. And then we're using a hierarchical selector here to go down to the anchor element and then access that element's attribute href, which gives us the URL. Woo, all right. So in those 2 lines, we covered quite a bit. We've talked about advanced selectors. We covered dynamic actions a little. We also talked about the Apex JavaScript API, the navigation namespace there. Moving on. All right, so how can we dynamically set the header of, when you have let's say a master detail interactive grid combo, how can we dynamically set the child region such that it has some context from what's been selected in the header? Here's an example of how that would work. So if I select a department, you see the name of the department down there. If I switch to research, you see that reflected there. This isn't offered out of the box, but it's very easy to do with a little bit of JavaScript. I actually answered this one, and these are the lines of code that I came up with, 4 lines of code here. Again, meant for a dynamic action. You can see what that would look like here. So in the when, I'm saying when the selection changes of the interactive grid region departments, then execute this JavaScript code. And it's 4 lines because I'm using variables to break down the code. Technically, I could have done all of this with a single line. I could have taken what's on the right-hand side of this equals operator and put that where we see selected record. And I could have taken all of that and put that where we see selected department and all of that where we see new text. But of course, that would be impossible to maintain. So we break it up with variables. And the way we do that in JavaScript, declaring new variables, is with the var keyword. There are some newer keywords if you're working with modern browsers, and can guarantee no one will be using something really, really old like IE 9 or 10 or whatever, but var still works, so it's easy to use. So here I'm declaring a variable called selected record, and I'm setting it equal to, and I'm using this reference to this .data. And that looks a little mystical until you find out that when you're in execute JavaScript code and you focus in the code attribute, if you go to the help, you'll see that they tell you that they're providing you quite a bit of context related to what's happened in the event, the parent portion. So here, what you can see is that when you select one of these things, if you have the console tab open, the dynamic action framework will log out this value, and you can open that up and kind of see what's going on in there, and you'll see this data attribute. And in the data attribute, that's where I found this selected records array. And it was an array with a single value, but it had the one I was looking for, the name of the department. So that was promising. And I also noticed this model as well. So the first thing I did, I got the selected record. That's an array of arrays. And with the master detail, you should only have one parent selected. So I just go after that, the one element there. And then I have the selected record, which will have the column values. Now, I could have just said, okay, the sales, the name of the department was like the third element in the array, the selected record array. But I was worried that if somebody changed the order of the columns, that could change the order in the array. So I needed something a little bit more useful. And this is where that model came in handy. So in order to use it, I just kind of scanned the JavaScript documentation and eventually came across something that looked promising. Under interfaces, there was this model object. So when I drilled in on that, I saw it had a number of methods. I just had to look through them again until I found something interesting. And I saw this get value method. And if you pass in a record and the field name, it will retrieve the value from the record given the correct position. So this was a bit more reliable. So that's what I used to get the department name field. And then I generated the new text I wanted to display in the region header as a single variable. And then I could select that region header using a jQuery selector, another hierarchical selector, and then just update that text as needed. So just a few lines of code to get that done. And at this point, we've covered the entire spectrum of categories. So we have declaring variables now in JavaScript, talked about the model interface in the Apex JavaScript API, and we've also looked at the console tab in our browser's developer tools. So for the last one here, this is another one I saw out in the wild. It was how do you delete a row from a classic or interactive report? And so the use case here is fairly common. You're going to show a report to a user and you want them to be able to delete a row. They'll get maybe a prompt, and then the row just sort of disappears, and they can repeat that process as often as necessary. So for this one, I thought it would be fun to do a live demo. So let's go ahead and dive in. And here I am in my workspace in apex.oracle.com. So what I'll do is show you, first of all, you can go to the SQL Workshop, Utilities, and under Sample Data Sets, you'll see a number of sample data sets. The one I'm going to use is emp-depth. You can just go ahead and install that if it's not already installed. If it is already installed, it will simply refresh it, putting the data back as it was to start. Once that's done, you can go to the Application Builder, where you can create a new application. And I will call this Employees. And it's going to have a default home page. I'll add a page, which will be a classic report, again called Employees. And it will be on the emp table. So we'll go ahead and create that application. All right, so I'll run it real quick just to show you what we have at this point. If we go to employees, you can see we just have this basic report on employees. So what we want to do is add a new column first with some buttons. So if we go to the region, open up the columns, you'll see the columns we get by default. I'm going to right-click columns and select Create Virtual Column. And that will give us a new column without having to affect the SQL query. Now the default type is link. I'm going to change that to plain text, which exposes this HTML expression. But if you're like me, you don't know how to just write a button out of nowhere, no problem. Just go to apex.oracle.com/UT for universal theme, and that will take you to this application. This is actually a packaged app that's available within Apex as well, but it's just more convenient to go to apex.oracle.com/UT. There's a reference section here that has a handy dandy button builder. So you can come in here and you can see an example of a button above as well as the code you need to make it. So we can come in here and say delete. We can make this text with icon. We can set the icon to trash, pick the best one. We can then change its look, make it look dangerous, right? We don't want anyone clicking delete willy-nilly. At any rate, you get the idea. So once you have the code you want, you can just copy this, go back to your Apex app and paste that in. And then I'll save my changes and run it again. And you can see we have this new delete. If you want, you can try to center that. Maybe this will look a bit better. All right, there we go. So at this point, our button just doesn't do anything. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a dynamic action that responds to that click event. So I'm going to say delete was clicked. And so of course the event is going to be click, and the selection type, I want to do button, but unfortunately this is not a declarative Apex button that I can just select. Instead, I need to use some of these more dynamic options like jQuery selector or JavaScript expression. I'm going to go with jQuery selector here. And if you look at what the button has, if we go back to that HTML, you'll see that it has a number of classes that we could use to target it. But all of these are fairly generic and related to universal themes. So I'm going to add a custom one here, and I'm going to say delete emp. So we'll hit OK. And then I can go back to my dynamic action and say I'm going to target the elements that have a class, so the period. Oops. Delete emp. And for the true action, for now, I'm just going to say alert test. We'll save that. Make sure everything is working first. Now when I click on delete, I get my alert. I click on the next one, I get my alert. Cool. So now we'll go back. And of course, I don't want to do an alert. What I want to do is delete an employee. So for that, I can use execute PL SQL. This is one of our declarative AJAX actions. And I'm going to say delete from emp, where emp no equals. And here we realize that we're missing another important piece of the puzzle, if you will. I need to be able to refer to session state. Now I'm on page 2, and this item doesn't exist yet, emp no, but I'm going to need to create it in order to get this to work. Now emp no is one of these things where I'm going to need to pass the value from the DOM to session state prior to executing this. So I'm going to put this in the page items to submit as well. And then we can come over to the region and we will create this page item. It's going to be P2 emp no, and this will be a hidden field. No one needs to see it. And we need to disable this value protected usually in this particular case because our intent is in fact to change the value of the hidden item, not to just leave it as it was when the page loaded. So I'll save that and I'll run it again. And we click delete, say, on Smith. And I refresh the page, and Smith is still here. And you think, uh-oh, what's going on? So this is where another tab in your browser developer tools can become important, and that is the network tab. So if I click delete again on Smith, and I drill in on this network request. So there's these little filters here. All shows you a little too much when you're doing what we're doing right now. XHR is a terrible acronym, well, abbreviation for XML HTTP request object. Just think AJAX. And so I'm just going to see this one request go out here. And if I drill in on it, staying under the headers tab, I can scroll down until I see request headers. And in this, actually below that, form data rather, this is the data that's being sent from the browser to the server. And in it, you'll see items to submit, P2 empno, the value is empty. And that tells you what I forgot to do was map the value from this particular row, Smith, to that hidden item prior to invoking this declarative AJAX process. So that's the next thing I need to do. And for that, I'm going to create another true action. And this will be execute JavaScript. But of course, I need to do this before the execute PL SQL. So I'll move that up. Now, the question is, what code am I going to write? And I'm focused on the help here for a reason, which is to show you another thing you have access to, which is this .triggering element. So in the case of this particular dynamic action, triggering element is going to refer to the button that was clicked. Now, the button that was clicked does not currently have anything related to the employee that was clicked. And in fact, the empno column in this report is not even available to us. It's hidden. But there's a nice little workaround for that. What we're going to do is go back to the button column. I'm going to open up this HTML, and I'm going to add what's known as a data attribute here. So you start these with data dash, and the data dash is just an HTML5 thing where it's saying it's compliant for the HTML spec, and we're going to call it empno. And I'm going to set it equal to, and here's where I can refer to the empno column using substitution string syntax. So I'm going to say empno with the hashes on both sides. So if I say OK here and save and run the page, I'm just going to show you that now when we inspect the button, you'll see that that gets replaced out with the employee number for that row. You can look at the next button and see that it's 7499, and then the next one 7521, and so on. So once you have that in place, the next thing we want to do is map that where we need it to go. So going back to the dynamic action, now triggering element has this attribute. And the way that we get at that in native DOM API is using dataset. So that's just a property of the element. And then of course, it was data-empno. So the data dash goes away, that's dataset. And then it's just empno. So I'm going to say .empno. So this should be the value that was clicked. And what I want to do is use one of these Apex APIs to map that value where I want it to go. So I'm going to use $S for set. I'm going to invoke it and first pass the name of what I want to set. So that's going to be P2 empno, and we'll set it equal to this value. So I'll save that, run it, and this time, if I click on this row for Smith, go back to network, go all the way down, we see that it passed the correct value, and if I refresh, Smith is gone. But of course, we shouldn't have to manually refresh, so we'll add another action here, which will refresh the region, employees. And one last, by the way, that's the fire on initialization or page load attribute I was pointing out earlier. But we'll come down and do one more here. I'll put this one at the top because this is kind of an important thing. I'm going to confirm. I don't want to shout though. We'll ask if they want to delete that employee first. So we'll save that, run the page. Now we're looking at Alan. If I hit delete, we get prompted, are you sure? I can hit cancel and we're safe. If I do it again, are you sure? We say yes, it refreshes and Alan is gone. Now you may be thinking you're done. You go to delete the next employee and nothing happens. Now, I'm not going to cover this in detail today. I will, however, touch on this in a future talk, which I'll point out here at the end. But this has to do with the fact that with that refresh action, the content here was refreshed and the event bindings on the buttons were lost. There's an easy workaround, which is sort of advanced, but you just make it dynamic, save, and now when you delete employees and you get that, well, that one was saved by a referential integrity constraint. Let's try another one. Okay, so now that employee's gone, we got the refresh, but if I go to Blake, it still works, right? The button clicking is still prompting us. So we now have a working solution. Okay, so this slide, and these slides I should say I'll make available at the end, just kind of outlines sort of the steps I had. The order's not as all over the place. This is a little more easy to follow, but you can do this on your own afterward. And that last one I touched on Ajax, both under web APIs, Ajax is there, as well as under frameworks and libraries. I was using dynamic actions for that. And we looked at the network tab as well for developer tools. Now, if you'd like to learn more, I have an intro-level JavaScript course for Apex developers. It's available on YouTube. You can go to the Apex Oracle Application Express channel on YouTube, and you'll see it listed there. There's 3 main parts and a little kind of intro thing, but feel free to check that out. It will sort of round out some of the things that we're talking about here, definitely on the JavaScript side, as well as a few other things like events and DOM traversal. And at this point, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. I'm just going to point out, I do have my Twitter URL here. So again, if you want these slides, that's probably a good place to go. I'll make them available there right when this ends. And again, I just want to point out, I'll be doing another one of these sessions on dynamic actions. The hard parts where I will touch on sort of that thing I just showed you, the advanced thing where the event binding didn't work. We'll talk about that some, and some other aspects of dynamic actions, which can be a little bit difficult, but it all comes down to these same concepts. Okay, are there any questions?